We're going to look at climate and temperature of the Pacific Northwest, and we can see when we think about temperature and precipitation, which are overwhelmingly the key characteristics of climate, in the case of the Pacific Northwest, temperature, how does it vary? Of course, it does vary a little bit latitudinally. As we go north, it does get a little bit colder. Of course, Vancouver is going to have a little bit cooler temperature on average than Portland, but there's two different characteristics that really make this area unique. First off, the maritime influence, and so it's got the big old Pacific Ocean over here that helps to moderate temperatures, and so Portland, Seattle, Vancouver don't really get too hot in the summertime, but also don't get too cold in the wintertime. In fact, Vancouver, it's way up in Canada. It's got all these snow-capped mountains really close to it, but in fact, it actually has a much warmer winter than you would have in Indianapolis. So the maritime influence in terms of moderating the temperatures, that's one. The other key characteristic very clearly seen is the role of altitude. And so altitude is going to play a very key role in understanding where people do live and where they don't live. And so they're going to live more likely in the lowland areas. The highland areas can be rugged in particular out in this particular area, but you can see the Olympic Peninsula and Olympic Mountains along with the Cascades and the Coast Mountains up in Canada combined are very upland areas. And those upland areas subsequently are so far up that they actually have snow-capped mountains that remain there year-round. And these stretch all the way down into California. So in terms of temperature, we can really see the role of maritime, but also altitudinal effects there for sure. But let's focus in on precipitation, because that's really the key thing going on here. And so what we got is the Pacific Northwest, it's very wet. It gets a good amount of precipitation, and we should already know the key reason for that. And so we look at the climate map. We're going to see certain characteristics. The climate map, we're going to see this mustardy color throughout much of the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. And this mustard color relates to warm summer and Mediterranean. Mediterranean climate, key characteristic of Mediterranean climate is a wet winter and a dry summer. Also what we have here is we have this lime green area, and that's associated with oceanic. That's going to be a marine west coast climate. So that's going to be a characteristic is going to be cooler, but also a whole lot more rainfall, a whole lot more precipitation. The reason for that is because of orographic precipitation. Here we have two large mountainous areas. First off, the Olympic Peninsula, but also the Cascades that come right through western Washington and western Oregon. So the mountains definitely play a key role in changing the climate. In fact, on the other side of the mountains, we have this very stark, I love how green and purple are complementary colors. They kind of really contrast each other, but that purple, desert. So that's essentially more of a desert, cold, dry desert that you're going to find there. And so we'll see this really play out when we look at different types of aerial photographs. So those are going to follow. And so here we have orographic precipitation at work, and I've already shown this beforehand. So a warm parcel of air that has a little bit of moisture is forced to rise. It's then eventually going to cool. It's going to then eventually cool, condense, and fall back down as rain. And so thus we typically get wet sides of the mountain, and that's typically going to be the windward side, whereas then on the other side we get a little bit more of a dry pattern, especially the farther we get away from that summit, from that peak area. And in the case of this particular aerial photograph, we can clearly see the difference between on one side very lush and green, and on the other side very dry. So you can see the Cascades on one side here in Oregon, and then on the other is very desert, very much a rain shadow. And so without even knowing anything about the topography, we can go ahead and pretty much predict that right through this middle area is where we have the mountains, and then essentially what we got is a little bit of runoff that helps fill these valleys and so forth. But you get farther away from the peaks here of the Cascade Range, it gets extremely dry. And so that's the precipitation characteristic in terms of orographic, where we're going to see that in those upland areas in particular. And so here we have a major rain event, and so this is more common in the winter time. They get a lot of rain, and this makes sense as I mentioned beforehand. This area has a lot of that Mediterranean characteristics, Mediterranean, wet winter, dry summer. And so you can see how this warm water, this is essentially the water that comes off of the Pacific Ocean, comes in contact with Vancouver Island, but also comes in contact with the coast ranges, Mount Olympus and the Olympic Mountains, Olympic Peninsula, but then also comes in contact with the Cascade Mountains. And so subsequently there you can see the orographic precipitation really at work in producing the high rain totals here on the windward side of these mountains. However, on the other side of the Cascade, and we go to the interior, more of the Columbian Basin, but also the more of the intermontane west, the empty quarter area, very, very dry. But one of the characteristics we do have is in where people live, Vancouver, parts of Victoria, the Puget Sound area, and farther down the Willamette Valley in Portland, where people do live, is actually in a kind of a miniature rain shadow. So over here, too much rain. Over here, too much rain. But right through here in these lowland areas, because they're kind of protected, they're kind of in between, sandwiched in between these two larger mountainous areas, have a little bit of a rain shadow effect. And so as the air comes over the mountains, it kind of descends and it's dry. And so subsequently we can see not as much rainfall here. And then it continues on and it's lifted again by the Cascade Mountains and continues on and it's dry. So this is kind of a misnomer. People think of Seattle, oh man, all it does is rain. Well, actually, it doesn't rain all the time. And so, Indiana actually has certain months of the year where they get a whole lot more rain than they do in Seattle. And so what it is kind of more that this kind of constant cloud, kind of constant mist. As this air is descending, it still's got a little bit of moisture, obviously, because it's going to then produce even more rain over here in the Cascades. And so essentially this little miniature rain shadow effect, which you really see clearly over there, creates a little bit of a drier area in this this Puget Sound and the Fraser Lowland and the Willamette Valley. And so understanding where people live plays a key role. But we look more broadly in terms of this particular area. It has in the wet season, the winter time, it's dominated by this west to east pattern of rain and deluge and just constant dreariness and a good amount of rain. Now, never really thunderstorms here, but just a good amount of rain during that winter period. However, in the summertime, kind of a high pressure moves up, and high pressure we associate with dry, and that kind of characterizes kind of more of its dry season. So you go up to Seattle, if you ever visit there. You go in the summertime, it's more likely to be dry. In the wintertime, it's more likely to be damp. Very characteristic of that particular area. So essentially what we've got is this broad idea of the terms of the precipitation, temperature characteristics of the Pacific Northwest. Let's go look at a more recent characteristic of heavy precipitation during the winter period. And so what this does is it shows these torrential atmospheric rivers. And in the California section, I'll talk a little bit more about these. The Pineapple Express would be an example of one of these. But I'll go ahead and put this sucker in motion, put this map in motion. Hopefully it loads up pretty well. And so what we have is we have these rivers of rain. And so notice this is the winter time. This is February. And so you can see the ranges, the mountains. I wish I could really zoom in here. Really hitting California this time. But you can see how it hits those mountains. These huge, heavy rainfalls. These rivers of precipitation come ripping through here. Boom, look at this one. Boom, look at all that precipitation hitting the Pacific Northwest during this particular period here. And so essentially what we've got here is we've got this characteristic of the rainy wet season that we see these torrential rains that are associated from these rivers of atmospheric motion that pull in moisture and pulls it in, and then subsequently that moisture comes and it interacts with those coastal ranges and the Cascades that essentially run parallel to the coastline, creating orographic precipitation. But notice, as these wind patterns continue from west to east past these mountain ranges, you can see how the precipitation starts to die away, fades away as it gets to the interior.